Hi, my name is Kristin Huggins. I am a Cohort 6 EDD doctoral candidate with Baylor University School of Education in the Learning and Organizational Change program. And today it's my immense honor to be able to present to you the findings of my POP dissertation study in preparation of my upcoming defense. I am a division chair of fine arts and kinesiology and a professor of voice at a two-year college in East Texas. And my research focuses on the applied studio instruction experience, specifically looking at how instructors classify their students. So I will go ahead and share my presentation with you. Fantastic. And this dissertation study was supervised by the lovely Dr. Karina Call. So we're going to look at the problem statement and purpose statements of the study. We'll look at the thematic analysis of the literature review, the 5 research questions that guided this study, Richard Baldry's theoretical framework, and the quantitative causal comparative methodology that I chose to answer my 5 research questions. And then we'll review the results and implications and recommendations for my field of research. And then distribution plan for dissemination post-successful defense. And of course, I would not be here today if not for a group of very special, very hardworking people. And so I want to make sure to send out my gratitude and thanks to those people for where I am at today. As I said before, I have been teaching in higher education for 10 years as a professor of voice. And when I began teaching, it became very apparent very quickly that my education through a private university vocal program and conservatory level vocal program didn't quite prepare me for how I should classify my students and assign appropriate repertoire, help with casting, help with audition portfolios, etc. I knew the parameters to work with. I knew that tessitura and timbre and the second passaggi and range, all of these things were really important and needed to be looked at, but I wasn't quite sure how to place all those together with one another, how they interacted with one another, which had more weight, and how I should assess the results of those findings in a really formulaic way. Further digging into the literature showed me that there really is no universal acknowledged system of voice classification in higher education practices. It's often a very subjective process that teachers or instructors learn from their own experiences. So how their teacher classified them is a lot of times kind of how you then adopt your own classification protocols. And in contrary motion, if a student is misclassified, it can have very risky negative outcomes for not only their academic success, but for their long-term career trajectory, because misclassification means that they're assigned an appropriate repertoire, which their vocal cords may or may not be able to support physically, and can result in vocal nodes, vocal polyps, voice rehabilitation, and in extreme cases, surgery or loss of voice entirely. So classification is definitely a very important topic in my field of interest. I conducted a thematic approach to my literature review and identified 4 quadrants of interest: a historical analysis of voice classification, the vocal parameters used in classification, not only by my theoretical framework of Richard Baldry, but other scholars as well, higher education practices for the applied studio and ensemble direction. So since those were my 2 pre-existing faculty groups, I really wanted to dive into the literature to see what differences and similarities existed between those 2 groups already, what their needs were in those classroom spaces, and what may or may not influence or affect classification for those 2 groups. And then most importantly, I wanted to look at the scholarly deficits of voice classification. So in the last 5 years, there has been truly not much literature or empirical studies on voice classification. And so it was really difficult to kind of figure out, what's currently being done, how are faculty learning these processes, what are students' perceptions of them. And with that, I developed the purpose statement. The purpose of this non-experimental causal comparative quantitative study, a mouthful, was to investigate potential differences in voice classification methods used by full-time applied voice faculty and ensemble directors in higher education undergraduate music programs. So 5 research questions guided this study. 3 were descriptive in nature, meaning that they were answered using descriptive statistics. I certainly hope I don't lose power. Research question 1 looked at the vocal parameter most used and most valued by higher education voice faculty members. Research question 2 looked at whether there was an observable difference in the frequencies of reported responses based on the institution where faculty acquired their degree from, so public, private, or conservatory. And then question number 3 looked at classification testing methods. So how often and for what duration of time were vocal students tested by faculty respondents? Research question 4 and 5 were answered using inferential statistics, specifically non-parametric Mann-Whitney U-test, which we'll get into just a little bit later. And I was looking whether there was a statistically significant difference in how often voice classification parameters were used between applied voice faculty versus ensemble directors, and then how often vocal exercises were used between applied faculty versus ensemble directors. So there was 13 voice exercises that I identified using the work of Gish et al. And those 13 voice exercises were then presented to faculty participants to see which of those they used to classify or to test a student's vocal range, tessitura, passaggi, etc. For my theoretical framework, I based my classification system on Richard Baldry, who is, based on the literature, the gold standard for American music education and operatic classification and German Fach. But I want to be very clear, based on this visual here, you can see that there are 6 categories of voice types, soprano all the way down to bass. I did not include the subcategories within the German Fach system, and that's because in the literature, many sources spoke to the risks of early classification using the Fach system with younger singers. So because I did focus on undergraduate coursework, which is considered young for the voice takes quite some time to mature. I wanted to be sure and be mindful of that risk and stick just to the major 6 categories and not dig further using subcategories such as light lyric, coloratura, dramatic, spinto, etc. And then Baldry provided the 6 parameters that also guided the study as well. As I stated earlier, this is a non-experimental causal comparative study looking at 2 pre-existing groups of faculty participants. I had a little difficult time establishing the specific population or the number of people in the population of the study. That's because there really is no faculty directory available in census data for music faculty, much less voice faculty. And so I had to take 2 or 3 different census reports and make some very approximate calculations to generate this number here for my population. And then for my sample, eventually I collected 114 surveys, and after data cleaning and ineligibility criteria, that became 90 eligible faculty respondents for the study. Surveys were actually sent to 1,141 faculty members that I data mined from the National Association of Schools of Music Accreditation Directory. And that directory only lists school names by state. So I had to go to each school, at 339 to be exact, and data mine faculty contacts from those schools. So I think I got through about 24 states within the time allotted for my data collection. So there are more schools out there, which will be talked about in implications for future research. And I developed a 15-question survey disseminated through Qualtrics based on the work of Wolverton, who examined voice parameters used to classify choral students in the high school setting, and Gish et al., who, as I spoke to earlier, examined the voice exercises used by voice faculty in the undergraduate level. So those 2 really kind of served as the inspiration for this developed and piloted survey. And then finally, data analysis. We looked at descriptive analysis of research questions 1 through 3, assumption checking and inferential analysis of research questions 4 through 5 using Mann-Whitney U-tests, and then interpretation of the results based on the 5 research questions. So results from the research questions. Tessitura was by far the most valued and most used voice parameter for voice classification overall by faculty, followed very closely by range and passaggi. Those were very, very close in results. Timbre came in at 4th, and then flexibility and agility were not quite as loved or used by overall faculty respondents. While there is some variation here with range that you can see, there wasn't a large observable difference between the overall parameter used by people who attended public, private, or conservatory music programs. So tessitura, again, came out as always being used during classification, followed closely by range and passaggi, which were similar results to question 1. Research question 2 was really interesting for me. It showed that 30% of faculty take 5 to 10 minutes to test student voice type. That was the highest percentage of faculty reported for that question. And 23% of faculty test students once a year. Again, that was the highest percentage reported. Interestingly enough, 15% of faculty reportedly don't test students at all. And that number was quite stable. I believe it was 14% for the other half of research question 3. So one asked, how often do you classify your students, and the other was how long do you take? And 15% answered how long do you take, and 14% answered how often. And so that's really interesting for me to see that the fact that amount of faculty don't classify their students when American systems are so heavily emphasizing performance-based assessment criteria. So yeah, interesting pin to put in that for research question 3. And then when I looked a little further between the 2 faculty groups, I found that applied faculty tend to take longer to test students than ensemble directors, but based on the literature review findings and based on personal experience as well, but mainly the literature review, applied faculty do have a bit longer and a bit more leeway to test students than ensemble directors who are working with many more students in a much shorter time frame. Results for research question 4 showed that applied voice faculty use passaggi statistically significantly more than ensemble directors when classifying their students. So that had a medium effect size. Range had a small effect size, but not statistical significance. And the other parameters showed no statistical significance whatsoever and very small effect sizes. And then research question 5 looked at the vocal exercises used between the 2 groups, and there was no statistical significance found in those as well. There were small observable differences found in the effect size, but not large enough to denote a statistically significant difference. So the implications and recommendations for this study, I have 4 stakeholders for this group: voice faculty, voice students, vocal pedagogy curriculum, and future research. Because this is a foundational study, I didn't feel comfortable yet making an implication for a change in classification protocol. But what I would like to recommend based on this data is that a formal communication plan of some sort be devised to be shared between the applied faculty and the ensemble faculty. So a lot of times we share students between these 2 groups, especially within voice major categories. And so if I have a student in my applied studio that is also taking choir, it would really be beneficial to talk with the choir director, or at least see notes on our classification results, our classification methods, to share that knowledge and to kind of expand how we can better serve our students and better serve especially entry-level faculty who are just kind of getting started and learning these processes. For higher education voice students, I would definitely advocate that they develop a sense of agency and authority over their voices much sooner than what typically happens. So we see in the literature that by the time students get to the graduate level, they start to ask more questions. They start to really feel more comfortable getting to know their voice and what the limitations and strengths of their voice are. And so I would really encourage them to find that agency much sooner and ask questions in the undergraduate process as well. And that might help with comprehension of classification diagnoses. And then higher education administrators, I would strongly encourage them to support the inclusion of classification as a topic of interest in vocal pedagogy coursework. I think that whether or not we can come up with a universal system of classification or not, simply discussing some of these various models that I've found in the literature review, even with their slight deviations from one another, I think that just discussing them at all is really important and giving you some foundation of knowledge as opposed to nothing at all. I think it's going to be a launch point for further discussion and further scholarly inquiry, and eventually maybe some sort of meeting in the middle of minds, so to speak, in agreeing and as to those models of tessitura and models of passaggi and vocal range and how we use those in classification. And then finally, future research is needed to determine causal relationships since this was a non-experimental study. So I would love to continue postdoc research looking at classification efficacy, exploring faculty experiences and perceptions of classification. I'd love to investigate the origin of classification for faculty members, and then to uncover misclassification narratives of students. My distribution plan, it's a 3-tiered plan made up of academic journals, conference presentations, and a potential book chapter publication in the very far future once I've done some more postdoc research. But I think first and foremost, getting my work out into academic journals. These were the 5 journals that were featured the most in my literature review, and I feel like they would be the most appropriate based on those findings for this study dissemination. And then these 3 conferences, also are the 3 conferences that I participate and attend the most and that are the most helpful for me from an applied perspective. And so I will also plan on submitting for a call for proposals there. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. Thank you so much to my lovely faculty advisor, my second reviewer, Dr. Brenda Davis, to the entire EdD Research and Writing Development Center, to my cohort members, Dan and Shireen, and finally, last but not least, but my adorable husband, Wade. I'm so thankful for this process, and I'm so thankful for this experience. This has been amazing. So thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed it.